Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Alexander Dawson School's third Zoomcast. This Zoomcast today is going to focus on distance learning and really maintaining authenticity and collaboration in an online setting. That's something, here at Dawson, we've been acutely aware of as we've pivoted towards teaching and learning in traditional settings to moving to our virtual, classrooms. Today, just like my other two Zoomcasts, I'm joined by our assistant head of school, Roxanne Stansbury, but also with an amazing collaboration of Dawson colleagues who are here today to share their expertise and what they're currently experiencing. For our listeners out there, which, we hope are going to be parents and educators at Dawson, but also parents and educators across the country, some big takeaways, for us are going to be, how distance learning has been an excellent time to leverage open-ended tasks, complex instruction, and right to learn activities. A second major takeaway that we're hoping, folks walk away with is the fact that true deep learning happens not on a worksheet or through a series of commercial videos and close-ended tasks, but rather learning is ongoing. It's a conversation where students are finding their own ways, to engage at their own pace and at their own tempo. And the last, and this is probably the most important one, is that we're really hoping that everyone out there remembers this fundamental fact, right? And that's the current crisis is allowing educators to reflect on what it truly means to learn and to learn deeply about subjects that they're studying. So that's our hope. As always, we're going to accompany this Zoomcast with a blog that will have additional information and links to resources that we might discuss today. But to kind of kick things off, I'm hoping everyone on our panel can introduce themselves. So their name, what they do at Dawson, and in true Dawson fashion, as we think about social emotional temperature checks, one word to describe their current emotional state. So I'll let Roxanne kick us off with introductions.
Hi, Andrew. I'm Roxanne Stansbury. I'm the Assistant Head of School for Teaching and Learning. And in that role, I really look at what pedagogy at Dawson looks like. And from teacher training to the delivery of our curriculum, making sure that we are always building connections with our students and deepening understanding. And my social emotional check-in word, I was not ready for that. And I think I've mentioned this before, but it vacillates throughout the day. But right now, this is a topic that I absolutely love to talk about. And I think authenticity is one of my favorite words. So I'm kind of like jazzed up right now. I think there's so much that people want to talk about when it comes to distance learning. And today we're going to talk about, why authenticity is so essential.
Hello, I'm Matthew Reynolds. I'm a 6th and 7th grade math teacher here at Dawson. And my one word is definitely optimistic. It's very easy to not be optimistic during these times, but I've kind of preferred to take the more positive track and just look at all the positive things that I've been able to do as a result of this distance learning we've been doing.
Hi, I'm Nikki Baker. I teach 2nd grade here at Dawson, and my word is eager. I'm eager to see how distance learning and the situation that we're all currently in is going to change in the future.
Hi, I am Hưng Lee, and I'm an art teacher. And one word to describe how I feel right now is grateful. Because considering what's going on out there, we are still able to teach our students, and the students still able to learn. Everything's still on the right track, and I think we are doing a very good job.
Hi, my name's Simon Hunt, and I teach 7th grade critical literacies at Dawson. I'm in my 3rd year there, and I also have an elective on debate and mock trial. And if I were to choose one word to describe my experience recently, I think the word would be learning. I'm learning a lot very quickly. That certainly comes with some stress, but it comes with a lot of excitement also.
Well, thank you everyone on the panel, for being here. For our listeners out there, if their one word to describe, how they're doing is any indication of how this Zoomcast is going to be going, I think it's going to be filled with learning. I think we're grateful that people are here. I'm eager for the conversation, optimistic about what I'm going to learn, and I'm super jazzed up about Roxanne, taking us through, some initial table setting questions. So, to that end, Roxanne, before we get into kind of the crux of this conversation, some larger, probably 10,000 foot questions for you to kind of kick things off. And the first is this, why is authenticity and collaboration, why are those necessary ingredients for great teaching and learning, like period? Doesn't matter if it's happening in a classroom or virtually. Why are those just absolute necessities for great teaching?
Yeah, I think it's mostly because the teaching profession is shifting to more of an architect role. And our job, because our students have access to all of the content and they have access to so much information, what we need to do is be able to design what that experience looks like so that they have the opportunity to extrapolate the content that they're receiving. And when you shift to a distance learning model, I think that all of that content sometimes triples. And what kids often and quickly find themselves in is a barrage of digital bombardment. And so if teachers are holding close that need for authenticity, then they know less is more. And that designing that experience that allows kids to process and synthesize and kind of unpack the experiences that they're having with the content, that's what the key to learning is. So I think about, taking kids on a virtual field trip. Oftentimes, if teachers have to shift and start to think virtually, it's very easy to revert to the simplest forms of teaching. I teach a skill, I assess the skill, and I'm out. But what our kids need right now is they need that competency teaching, and they need assessment of the competencies. And so if you think about how to make really meaningful online lessons, you're going to provide the content, let's say a virtual field trip, but it's like, what are you going to do after they take that virtual field trip? Because going on that field trip alone in isolation, that's not learning. That's just an experience. It's the reflection that we do after the experience. It's how we engage in right to learn activities where we actually have to take something that we observed or that we learned from that virtual field trip, and now I have to translate it into another writing format. That's where learning takes place. And it's a real art. And again, it's back to that architect role.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think the two words that you kind of talked about that I think are really illuminating here is, this idea of, teachers being architects and teaching being an art form, right? Mm-hmm. And I think, at the end of the day, what we're asking our teachers to do, whether it's currently in the virtual learning space or here on campus, is to become makers of meaning, right? And makers of really meaningful experiences. And you have been the architect of our transition to, virtual learning, ensuring the fact that our teachers can, make meaning even remotely. So I guess to that end, how did you make sure that authenticity and collaboration were kind of cornerstones to our virtual learning experience and really emphasizing that to our teachers?
Well, I think number one, it was making sure that we didn't take a one-size-fits-all approach. What we do in second grade is not what we did in fifth grade. And, some of our middle school classrooms, they were ready to move from an asynchronous model to a synchronous model much quicker than our younger grades, because we are constantly in contact with what our kids need. And I think that is one key to authenticity. Don't lose sight of where your kids are at and the executive functioning skills they need to move on to another layer of virtual learning. So I think that's one piece. I think another piece is, we used a 1-point rubric. And we had to make this pivot really quickly, pretty much in a matter of a day. And so that weekend, we were all working furiously. I mean, I would call Nikki up and say, all right, I need some help here, Nikki. I'm creating this rubric, but I want to be able to create models so that when we're presenting this one rubric that's going to anchor our teaching together, that there are some actual samples and examples. And so she was creating videos and feeding them to me so that we could put out, something that could serve as that architect guide. And a number one component of that architect guide was that meaningful experiences that we were going to build.
No. Well, thank you for that overview. Well, now I've got some kind of questions in this, as we engage this dialogue that, I'd love our panel of teachers and experts, kind of chime in on. So, the first is, really this, here at Dawson, our education, experience balances foundational skills with core competencies. So how can you model and provide opportunities for application and measuring competencies within a digital space?
I think I can speak to that, Andrew, a little bit. When it comes to competencies in my math classrooms, one of the things that I'm constantly focusing on and modeling is a willingness to be okay with making mistakes and having that perseverance to not only be okay with making mistakes, but also to do something about it. So what that looks like in online learning so far is all year long, we've been doing a correction process in my class where they have a piece of paper and they need to address what mistake they've made, what change they're made, and illustrate their work. And now it's actually better in an online environment because I've used Flipgrid to have them have to use the screen on Flipgrid. If you're not familiar with it, there's a drawing tool. And as they're explaining their thinking, they can write right on the screen and show, and I can pinpoint exactly where their misunderstanding still exists or was rectified because of their correction process, and they can submit that to me, and I can write feedback back to them, and we can go back and forth, and I'm not bound in a classroom where they can only speak to me for a certain amount of time.
Yeah, so if I'm hearing you, it's, ultimately too, you've been given the opportunity, right, to have that more kind of personal, engagement as it relates to the one-on-one learning, and to model the fact too, probably that you're, learning a new skill set as well, as it relates to, how students are interacting and engaging with your lessons, too. So that's fantastic. Other folks on the panel, other thoughts about how you've been modeling or providing opportunities for measuring different competencies in a virtual classroom?
Yeah, bouncing off of what Matt said about using Flipgrid for math, we've been using it in second grade, so it kind of looks the same, but we tell the students, like, pretend you're teaching a first grader how to solve a math problem using partial sums, because it just breaks down the language for them, and then they are taking ownership of that process, and then the kids are able to go step by step through the video. And just like what Matt said, I'm able to catch if there's a misstep, or I can respond and say, can you tell me more about how you got from this number to that number? And then also to be able to give that individual feedback, and they maybe only solved one problem, but I was able to see that they actually got it, more than just I can assign some problems and they can solve it on paper and pencil and take a picture and put it on Google Classroom, but seeing that they actually understand the process of how to get to that solution really helps me know that their understanding is strong of the concept.
No, I love that. I love the tangible example, you both have used, a Flipgrid, and in the blog that will accompany this, we'll link probably to a Flipgrid resource. So, our viewers out there can get a better sense of when we say Flipgrid, what does that actually mean, right? And I love that you mentioned, kind of a concrete, specific example of a tool, that you're using to enhance the teaching and learning. So, I guess a follow-up question to kind of drill down a little bit further, into this would be, how are you leveraging some of the other features of online learning to deepen, right, student thinking or understanding? Are there other tools or resources or technologies other than Flipgrid that you're incorporating on a regular basis?
Something that I can say towards that is there's an online site called Desmos.com, and that has to do a lot with graphing. And recently with pre-algebra students, we've been talking about the difference between the slope of a line and kind of where it starts on a y-axis. And there's this game called Marble Slides that they absolutely love, where they have to there's balls that drop onto the screen and they have to move their line to try to kind of catch the balls and put them into a hole. So it's interactive, it's online. I can see their progress on my screen as I go, and I can submit feedback to them in real time. And along with that, also just simply Google Meet rooms have been revolutionary for what I do as a teacher. I can bring a student or a group of students into a Google Meet room, and I can just say, here's a problem. Can you just discuss with me how you go about solving this? And then when I know for sure that they know what they're doing, I can send those students over to help other students in other Google Meet rooms. So it's hugely helpful for my instruction.
Yeah, maybe, and along those lines, I don't know if sure other folks out there have been bombarded, right, and inundated, over the course of the past couple of weeks with, different educational technology companies that are beginning to sprout up, right? And I only think that, on the horizon, we're going to see more and more, for-profit, either educational tools or technologies, kind of come about. So I guess from a teacher standpoint, or, even as an administrator, Roxanne, I'd love to get, some perspective on, how is it that we are selecting, content or design experiences that help students both extrapolate meaning from the content, but also develop content as well, right? And so how is it that you're deciding between what's a great tool, versus what's a tool that's going to be cumbersome, in terms of as we pivoted to this virtual world?
Yeah, I think one of the important things is that you start with what do you want the students to do in regard to their thinking first, and then you match the technology tool with your intended goal. And so we've been able to do that when we talk about if our goal is to get kids to be able to collaborate and communicate, and those are the competencies that we want to focus on, then what's the online technology tool that's going to really elevate or redefine that opportunity for kids to hone that competency? So we talked about Flipgrid being an opportunity for kids to be able to reflect, dialogue, leave feedback for each other. Sometimes it says, like, we want to be able to give really interactive assessments. And so what's the tool that will help us keep kids engaged and also conduct informal assessments? We found Nearpod to be one of the best tools for us to be able to provide content, but also check for understandings or misconceptions along the way through some really interactive features. Sometimes it's about being able to collect your work and be able to see it over a given amount of time in a portfolio kind of setting. And we found Seesaw to be a tool that fits that need. And so again, starting with the competency that you're trying to build in a student first, and then aligning it with the technology tool that has the features or the affordances to build that competency has been the approach that has worked best for us.
Yeah, so I think if I'm hearing you right, essentially, how we've leveraged technology is just enhancing a lot of the teaching and learning that we've already done, right? And probably now more than ever, we're just relying upon it, not to get in the way, right, of instruction, but rather to enhance it and to give our students what they need. I think you said something, I thought that was really interesting, Roxanne, which was, you have to ask the question, what is it you want students to do? And what is it you want them to learn most? And then you went on to talk about, I think 2 skills that mean a lot to us, here at Dawson, which are, collaboration, and communication. And we can never lose sight of how is it that we're developing collaborative learners, and how is it we're developing students who are able to communicate well with a diverse, perspective, and diverse audience as well. I think another thing that means a lot to us, here at Dawson is how is it that we're getting our students to think about their work, right? And to reflect not just on some of the things that they've done, but to reflect upon, what it is they're learning and how they're learning, and to be, totally self-reflective in their craft as students. So, maybe to that end, why is reflection so important for student learning? And what does reflection, look like now that we have transitioned to online instruction?
Well, I can speak to that a little bit in critical literacies class. As a reading and writing teacher, I really think reflection is pretty much everything. That's what we're going for. We want them to be able to read and write as skills, of course, but the real value of those skills is in the reflection, in the long-term learning, and what you're able to take with you from year to year. So a lot of what I've been doing has been to transfer things I've always done into a virtual context, into a distance learning context. And that's really about choosing readings carefully, giving students freedom to choose the readings that interest them, guiding their readings in ways that aren't just about getting through pages, but are more about reflecting and connecting with the reading. And then when it comes time to write in response to the reading, asking them to write in ways which bring themselves into the writing, rather than just telling me what happens in chapter 7 or whatever it is. You know, I'd much rather hear the reflection. So some of it is a question of transferring what has always worked well into a new context. But there are some things I've been really excited about in this new context also, things that are a little different. The combination of synchronous and asynchronous classes, I think, has been really, really rewarding and interesting, has helped remind me of something important, which is that the synchronous class will often reward the less reflective student, the student who speaks most quickly and glibly about something, and the quieter, more deep thinking student doesn't always manage to make him or herself heard in class. But in an asynchronous context, like we find ourselves in more often now, as a teacher, I'm much more able to listen to that reflective student, the student who needs more time to think before they speak up. And related to that, I've just been really excited, as Mr. Reynolds kind of referred to earlier, by the Google Meets and the Google Hangouts. He spoke about the Google Meets, but in the case of my classes, for every book that the students are reading, they're reading in small groups. I've set up a Google Hangout where they can talk to each other about the book, you know, whenever it occurs to them to make an observation about the book, rather than waiting for the next class. And that's something I'm going to keep even when I'm back in my regular classroom. I speak up in those Hangouts sometimes, but more often I just listen. And it's just such an absolute thrill to see middle schoolers, you know, talking about the book that I've asked them to read with nobody making them do it, you know, asking questions about what's happening, what they think it means, what their friends think is going to happen next. And so that's been exciting to see them reflecting in that way.
Yeah, no, thanks, Simon. I think, you know, there's a lot there, you know, I think to digest, and so much of it is, you know, equal parts humbling, you know, and heartening, because I think we talk a lot about, you know, putting the students at the center of the experience. You know, I think sometimes, you know, as a classroom teacher myself, you become, especially teaching poetry or literature, you become afraid of silence, right? And sometimes you look at silence, you know, as a bad thing. And what I heard you, you know, say is, you know, the authentic, you know, style of how a student learns, it actually is starting to dovetail really nicely with both the synchronous and the asynchronous approach, right? Yep. Where that extroverted student, they're going to find, you know, their niche, you know, within, you know, a synchronous class. Within an asynchronous class, maybe that student that needs a little bit of more wait time, or that just like really cherishes, right, the quiet and the silence before that extroverted, you know, student speaks up, is able to have that moment as well. So I think that those are all things that give me, you know, a lot to think about, you know, as we think about what's currently happening with education, but also too, how we use this experience, right, to deepen our teaching and learning, you know, into the future as well. So I think that's something. You know, the other thing, you know, one of my, you know, mentors when I was in graduate school was Dr. Kevin Mattingly, and he used this expression all the time that says, like, if it doesn't transfer, it doesn't matter. Right? You're essentially wasting your time if it doesn't go from content, you know, into memory and then metabolized into kind of a deep working experience. So, you know, I love the fact that you were able to talk about transfer, you know, in that way. And it makes me think about how, you know, the pandemic, you know, now more than ever is a vehicle, right, for authentic, you know, and relevant, you know, teaching and learning. And I wonder if, you know, anybody on the panel out there, have you been able to put the pandemic into historical context for your students? Or, you know, how have you used this crisis to build empathy or self-reflection or critical thinking or debate, you know, about how we could be engaging some of these really important, you know, conversations as it relates to the global crisis that's going on?
Well, I know the students have been approaching the pandemic in that sense in their humanities class from a historical perspective, and they've also been approaching it from a scientific perspective in their science class. In my critical literacies class, I'm planning to ask them to reflect on their experiences in this unusual time in a poetry unit that we're just starting now, where they're moving from the expository and analytical writing they've been doing back into a more kind of personal and expressive kind of writing through poetry. And of course, they've got this, I guess you could say, great material, this very unusual material to write about. I can also respond to this question in the context of advisory, because I have 11 advisees that I check in with every morning and work with a couple of times a week in another context. And in the sense that our advisory program really focuses on students' social and emotional learning, I've made a serious point of talking to them about what they're living through, what they're experiencing, how they're responding to it, and giving them opportunities to talk to each other about that. Often with 7th graders, they feel great. They feel like it's an extended vacation, but at the edge of that, there concerns do appear about the the kind of historical moment we're in and how it's affecting our communities. So it's been rewarding to give them opportunities to talk about that, to ask them to reflect on the people who are helping in our community. That's a project we did in advisory, to write thank yous to medical staff who are basically seeing our community through this episode. So I've focused on that kind of historical context in advisory to some degree.
I think we also see some relevant uses of the pandemic to deepen our student understanding, or just even their ability to process this kind of experience in 8th grade. And so 8th grade is a year where we do a capstone project. And what we heard from our students this year is that the original traditional capstone project that we usually do each spring, that they just couldn't find the connection to it. That this school closure and quarantine and pandemic has really taken such a hold in a way that they were struggling. They were struggling to really engage in work that they didn't find as meaningful in a time right now when they're trying to, I think, juggle their own emotions and wrap their head around the impact that the pandemic has had on other people. And so we went for a remodeled approach of our 8th grade capstone project so that the students could look at the COVID-19 pandemic from 3 different perspectives: their self perspective, a school community perspective, and then a global community. And in working with the students, we were able to come up with some ideas on how this exploration and research could be approached, or the framework for how they wanted to approach this 3-perspective exploration. And so it could be, from their own point of view, just documenting what a day in the life of a quarantine in your house would look like, or how would you explain this quarantine to generations who come after you? Or how has it affected your own personal school life? What has it been like to be a distance learner? Where have you struggled? And then looking at it from a school community lens, the students are looking at how they can have their voice around what we do for our end of the year kind of celebrations, from graduation to yearbook signing, and what does that loss mean to them? We've also asked them to give us advice on what they think the 2020 and 2021 school year should look like, or to interview Dawson employees about the impact of the pandemic on different groups around our community. And then globally, we want them to, find examples of how people are demonstrating love and kindness during this really challenging time. Or to be able to connect with a nonprofit organization and say, find out how the pandemic has affected them. Or even compare and contrast how different governments have approached the closures from, comparing different countries. And so in the next few weeks, our students will be able to create some products that synthesize this research that they've been able to do from multiple perspectives.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing all that. It reminds me of I was having a conversation with a friend, and we were talking about that idea of collaboration and how collaboration, really is impacted by this idea of concentric communities, right? Which I think you were talking about. And that idea of concentric communities, probably starts with the self, right? Like, how are you a community of one? Then extends to your family, right? Then it extends to your class, school, Las Vegas, country, world. And I think, the underpinning of how we're framing that, for our middle school students in particular is just really, really powerful. I think that the second is, what I heard, both Simon, and you talk about, Roxanne, is that we want our students to engage and to think on a micro level and on a macro level, right? And that micro level is, how am I doing, right? How am I doing during advisory? How am I doing, just connecting with that first responder, right? And then on a more macro level, and that's that global level, what are we doing to think about our own individual, decisions within this global, experience that we're all engaging. And so I think, by doing some of those things, right, that's where we're collaborating with one another, in our classes, throughout our city, throughout our country. But in terms of, being authentic, in our approach, I think we're also asking our students to ask some really difficult questions, right? That probe, the moral fiber, of who they are and what they're hoping, the world can be. And so maybe to that end, I've been thinking a lot about just evolution, change, how the pandemic will, essentially potentially launch that next revolution, of education. And so, from our panel, be curious to know, how do you want teaching and learning to evolve, right? Because of what we've currently experienced. So any thoughts out there about how, you want education to transform and change because of what we've currently learned?
I think if you start to talk about, what do we need to do for the future of education, it's really involving values as part of how we want to be instructional designers, making sure that the experiences that we build, they have meaning, and that students are getting the skills, the knowledge, the competencies, and the opportunity to develop their values of who they are and how they can connect with other people around the world to build a broadened perspective. And that's a big goal at Dawson, is that perspective building. And so I think, the pandemic has taught us that there is unity in times of crisis, but you can only understand that unity if you're willing to put yourself in somebody else's shoes. And so I think that's a way that we can continue to evolve and use this experience to increase the genuine opportunities for students to connect with people beyond the school walls.
For me personally, from a math perspective, some very important things that are coming out of the world of mathematics right now is the fact that you can find the answer to almost any skill-based question without any help at all. So what I've been trying to focus on is not so much teaching the kids the skills, but giving them a task like, okay, you have to apply for a job, you have to do the landscaping for a backyard, you have to run a pet shelter. So those are things they can't Google. They need to use skills that they can Google, which I encourage them to Google, because we need to make them be finders of information. That's the most important skill. The information's out there. You need to just be able to know what information you need and be able to find it. So if I've just been using this time to focus more on projects that require finding those skills. If they need to find me to ask a question, they need to be able to feel comfortable communicating with me. And I need to have as much access to individualized instruction as possible, which this has given me a conduit to do. So I think that this has been a great just kind of jumping off point for mathematics education as we move forward in the 21st century, where kids have the skills available to them to understand what questions they need to be asking, rather than us teaching them just skills in isolation that they can find using a calculator.
I also have had a lot of thoughts about modern learning during this pandemic. Thinking about like what systems do we have in place or routines do we have in place that we do because they're kind of traditional, even as simple as like the kids, we order this many notebooks at the start of the year. We have all of these supplies that we need to order. And how can we use technology to limit some of those products and prepare our students to actually have a better skill set. In second grade, we print out their weekly homework. So instead of doing that, I haven't had to print out homework. They go onto their Google Classroom and they can see what is available to them. But then again, like how can I put assignments on there and still keep that asynchronous model for students that need more time to complete assignments. And it also is giving them instant feedback from completing their assignments, and it's communicating also with the family. So instead of getting an email at 8 o'clock at night saying, well, we don't know what the assignment is because they lost their homework sheet, it's all available to them. And the kids are learning a skill set by going onto the Google Classroom, and they're taking responsibility for their due dates and to submit work or to say like, I need an extra day. And so they're actually advocating for themselves rather than me coming and hunting down work. So there's that aspect of like, how can we change some of those traditions and routines that we've just constantly always have been doing.
So maybe, Hung Lee, I'd love to, kind of hear more, because I know that you've done, a really, really cool project with, our sister school, in Boulder. So maybe, if you could talk a little bit about just like what that project is that you're working on with Dawson and Boulder, but then also too, how that might be part of the future as well, right? Where we're able to, do a better job of working with other schools across the country, but also across the world.
Okay, so there is a collaboration art project going right now between our art student in Dawson School in Las Vegas and other Dawson School in Colorado. So the project was started before the lockdown, and we gave the student in both schools a survey question. The question is like, what is the biggest social issue that you face as a young person today? And 90% of students in both schools said it is a COVID-19 crisis. So I decided to use the pandemic as a final project in my classes. So one of the things I think what I should do in the future for my teaching is, I think the interaction between people really important. And just after the pandemic, so I realized that I should not use anything about a politics or anything about a controversial topics in my lecture, but I focus on the humanity or the empathy between people, the interaction between human and human. Because a lot of students said the quarantine had been driving them crazy, and they miss school, they miss the teachers, they meet friends so much, and they wish they can come back to their normal life. So obviously, the thing they call the normal life now becomes special for them. So based on that, I try to make them realize and appreciate the importance of seeing and interacting with real people and real life. And we had to admit that a lot of young people right now, like, they spend too much time on social media. So hopefully after this crisis, they will more appreciate the real things and the thing around them.
So maybe, Hung Lee, just to follow up on that for a second, how is it that you're getting, some of your students to be more reflective, right? Whether that's using art or just talking about some of the things that they're creating to move them away from social media to rather being reflective of how they're doing personally and emotionally.
Or they have been looking in a lot of work about like how they miss people in to see them in person, and like they send a lot of positive message to other people and a lot of hope. Like one day everything will become normal and we're gonna be doing just all right.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that, if we can have students, walk away with, right? And one of the things that changes, during this current pandemic is, a greater sense of positivity, right? A greater sense of reflection, a greater, sense of shared humanity, and to get our students to be able to understand, right? The cool thing is to be nice, right? The cool thing is to check in, right? The thing that, we're going to laud, in those students from kindergarten all the way through to high school and colleges beyond is that ability to check in with another human being, to share a story, to lend an empathetic ear, to understand that a divergent opinion that's converging on a shared experience has the ability to transform a life and lead to some really impactful moments where memories take place, where those memories are able to transfer. And those are the memories that we'll create within the confines of authentic and collaborative school learning and experiences.
I think it's important to point out, there's that therapy in numbers. We feel that as adults. I can sit here and start to think about the next school year and all the challenges and complexities to a point where, I can't even get out of my own head. But I jump onto an NAIS webinar, or I start to connect with people who are in the same kind of leadership roles across the country. And when you start to hear what everybody else is dealing with, you actually start to breathe easier. And I think our kids need that too. And so, something Hung Lee's doing for our students to also see that there's kids in another state in Colorado who have identical feelings, and then using art as a vehicle to express those feelings, like that's exactly the humanity that you're talking about. And our kids need the tools to help themselves deal with and manage emotions that they can't even identify right now. And one of the resources we can give our students is to help them build connections and realize, like, yes, sometimes we're alone in this, and we're also together. And those two are realities of alone together can coexist. And sometimes when we're feeling the way we feel, where it starts to get really challenging to think outside of ourselves, we have to connect with other people because it gives us strength, and it can also alleviate anxiety. And we know that our students, let's face it, everybody's dealing with heightened anxiety right now because there's so much unknown. One of the challenges I think of being an instructional architect is that you have to constantly think how to help kids think beyond themselves, because that's what their brain is wired to do. They're at that developmental age where they can only see the world through their lens. And if as an independent school experience like ours, we can get kids to stop and think about other people first, I think that is a true feat of teaching that we all want to be able to accomplish.
Yeah, no, 100%, right? And I think, one of the central catalysts for why we decided to do these Zoomcasts was information sharing. And what you just, shared, Roxanne, reminded me of an adage that Pat Bassett, who was the former president of NIS, used to use all the time, which was this: don't worry alone, right? And how is it that we create resources, information sharing, shared experiences to say, right, we just did this Zoomcast. How is it that we link to the work that Hung Lee and our sister school in Boulder are doing together, right? How is it that we have examples of Nearpod and Flipgrid that we're doing together? How is it that, even there's some, organic conversations, that Simon's having with his advisory group, are leading into, asynchronous and synchronous learning and sort of the Google Classroom. So how is it we share, all of those resources together to let teachers out there, other parents know, we're all in this together, right? This is how we're going to move with greater confidence towards our new abnormal, as we move forward. Maybe before, I kind of close it out, I just want to make sure, is there anybody else, on the panel, any kind of, final thoughts or ideas that, kind of popped into your head as we've been talking today?
Yeah, I would like to talk about like the instant feedback my students have been getting. Last week we did an end of the year math assessment, and they used Google Forms for some of the questions, and then they used Google Slides to show some of their math problems, drawing them out. But I love the Google Forms because it gives instant feedback to the students. And I even had one of the second graders email me afterwards and say, "Thank you so much. I'm so proud of myself." And, for an 8-year-old to like see that moment and be like, wow, I was kind of stressed about this test, but I did so good. And she's like, "I feel proud of myself." And I thought, like, that is so amazing. Like, Whereas sometimes I have a stack of math tests and it can take me a little bit to get through grading them all and checking all like the work and, you know, seeing if they've explained it completely. And it takes a little bit to get that feedback to them. Whereas this remote learning has allowed us to give more instant feedback, even if you're using Flipgrid, to get on there and give a quick response to students individually. They're just receiving that quicker and they can, you know, assess their knowledge. And then I've even had parents reach out and say, okay, I see what problems they missed. We're going to go over it together. And then I can also offer, you know, and say like, do you want me to work with them on any concepts? Or the kids then are able to see quickly like, oh my gosh, it was such a simple mistake. I should have checked my work. So it's really helping them reflect on the process rather than I'm just done and I'm going to submit. Like, oh wow, so quickly I was off by one number. And I think that instant feedback is just such is so gratifying to the students.
Something that I would like to add real quickly is kind of speaking to the parents, but also fellow educators and even students that are watching this is Simon and myself are on the same 7th grade kind of team. And last week we kind of made a pact with each other that we were going to start helping less in general with students. And what do you know? It worked. The kids are not asking the same question over and over again. They're figuring it out for themselves. So you as a parent that I can't even imagine how stressed you sometimes are. And if the easiest thing often to do is to just give the answer to the student, but then they're probably going to ask the same thing the next day because they didn't really figure out how to do it themselves. You just kind of solved the problem for that day. So that's what we were doing too as educators. We were just, you know, where can I find this assignment? What page am I supposed to read? Telling them in a Google chat, instead of just trying to make them be those seekers of information that I've advocated for as mathematicians, and just saying, well, where do you think you could find that? Oh, on Google Classroom. Exactly. Then what do you know? The next day you don't get that question, so you can spend more time addressing the more important questions that students have and spending more time planning instruction and things like that. And you as parents in the long term are probably also going to be less burdened when your students can just start to advocate for themselves and solve those problems as they come up.
I would follow up on that just to say what we've really emphasized is that we'll try not to give students things they could do themselves, you know, as much as possible. And to approach that much more broadly, I will admit that I'm old-fashioned enough and old enough to be a little skeptical about new technologies when I'm asked to use them. I still remember the chalk technology and most days kind of miss it. You know, but I embrace the whiteboard because it was better, and I'll embrace new technologies all the time if they're better. And by better, I mean exactly what you were talking about a few minutes ago, Andrew. It's really about the students and fostering and enabling reflection and engagement. Not about new, you know, buzzers and whistles, but about systems of modern learning. Sorry, my cat is stepping in front of me. But systems of modern learning that will enable them to pursue richer understanding, richer engagement, richer reflection.
Yeah, no, I think, you know, first is, you know, I just want to share with everyone. Sorry, Roxanne, are you going to jump in? I saw the unmute, you know, come on.
I was just going to say what Simon is referring to are competencies. You know, we're teaching kids how to be great online learners. That means self-directed learning. That means heightened agency. That means knowing how to advocate when you need help. It means knowing an organization system or having an organization system. I think that is where our focus is, and that's what makes teaching authentic. It's not just knowing how to do the math problem. It's knowing if I get stuck, who do I turn to and how do I advocate for myself? How do I organize myself? I think those self-talk pieces that we want our learners to be doing as they approach their work. So very important in this time.
Yeah, no, it's and again, I keep going back to, you know, kind of two of my graduate school classes. You know, I mentioned, you know, Kevin Mattingly. The other is, you know, Megan Laverty, and they used to, you know, kind of do two things all the time. The first was, you know, whenever we were in class, they would say, "That's a great question. I'm not going to answer it." And I think what we all learned, you know, as students in that moment is we had the answers within ourselves, right? You know, so that's one, you know, of my takeaways. You know, the second is, I think, you know, as we think about this educational evolution, the role of teacher is quickly changing, right? You know, and, you know, one of my grad school, you know, professors would talk about, you know, teachers can no longer be the bouncers at the bar of knowledge, right? And we're moving, away from just that teacher being, right, yes, you have the right answer. No, you don't. It's about content, to what you talked about, Roxanne, where it's about competencies. And I think now more than ever, what we're going to see, moving forward as teaching continues to progress, is we're going to see the rise of the autonomous learner, right? And the rise of the autonomous learner will start, in Nikki's, class, in second grade. And that's where that seed starts, and then it transfers all the way through, early or upper elementary, through middle school, and beyond. And I think as a result of that, we're going to see students that are self-motivating, self-monitoring, self-adjusting, right, and self-assessing learners. And they're able then to go to teachers and essentially use teachers as guides, right, to help them, guide them, and to direct them, in the right areas. But at the core, it's about relationships. And what I'm really just heartened by are the authentic relationships you continue to form as teachers with our students and families, and how you found new ways for our students to collaborate with you and with their peers and with others. So just more than ever, thank you to our panel. Dawson's lucky to have you. To our listeners out there, hopefully this has been engaging, for you. Again, we'll link resources, to the blog, but thank you again for adopting and evolving, just a great mindset, and great opportunities for our students. So thank you so much, everybody.